Alright guys, we are back again today with our next lesson. Our next lesson is lesson 17 on narrative writing. This lesson is going to look a little different because I'm not going to do the entire thing with you guys and go through the whole process of writing the story, but I will be going through the steps with you of how to get there, and then I want you guys to be creative in the story and do the rest on your own, and I'm excited to see what you guys come up with. So, Lesson 17, Narrative Writing. One day, a guy woke up, went out, came home, and went to bed. This would be a pretty boring story, right? There are more questions than answers. Who is this guy? Where does he live? What happened when he went out? What kind of day did he have? Why should I care about him? A narrative is a story. A non-fiction narrative is a true story. A fictional narrative is made up. In either kind of story, the writer tells about the characters, what they do, and where they are. In a fictional story, the writer makes up many of those details. In this lesson, you'll learn about the kinds of things writers do to make their stories more interesting and fun. Tip 1. Describe your characters. Many readers want to know what characters look like, how they move, what they wear, how they feel about things, and even what their habits are. The more the author tells about a character, the more real the story becomes for the readers. Most stories have more than one main character. Make your characters different from each other in how they speak and act. That way, your readers will be able to know them better. What are some details you like to know about characters in stories you read? This is a good question. I love reading. I love stories with good characters. So some details I like to know, I'm going to go ahead and write down. Again, this can be different for you, so your answer does not have to be the same as mine. But some details I like to know about characters I read is, and I'm going to write this in complete sentences, I like to know details about what the characters look like, how they act, and my favorite part is when the narrator really gets inside the character's thoughts and feelings and tells us how they're feeling about certain things, how they act, and what they are thinking and feeling. I like to know details about what the characters look like, how they act, and what they are thinking and feeling. That was my answer. Feel free to put your own. Next, tip 2, describe a clear setting for the action. Tell your readers where the action takes place. It could take place anywhere, aboard a ship, at a park, on a farm, or on the top of the floor of a skyscraper. Use details to help readers imagine the scene. Tell about the salty sea air and the spray of mist against the hero's cheek. Remember that our imaginations don't just see and hear. They smell, taste, and touch too. Also tell your readers when the story takes place. Decide whether it is summer or winter, daytime or nighttime. It could take place anytime, now, 100 years ago, or 1,000 years in the future. Again, put your reader into the moment with details. If writing a story that takes place 100 years ago, people in it might drive a buggy instead of a car. Let readers hear the clip-clop of horses on brick streets. What other details might you include in the setting of the story? Well, we talked about where the story takes place. We talked about when the story takes place. Talking about seasons, day or night time. I think they honestly did a really good job of explaining everything that goes into a setting. So I'm just going to reiterate the things that they said. So I'm going to say, I would include details about when and where. Those are our two important words, when and where the story takes place. I would include details about when and where the story takes place. Tip 3, use dialogue in your stories. Very good tip. Readers like to hear characters speak for themselves. Let the characters tell the story by talking to each other. When characters talk to each other, their speech is called dialogue. Make sure to use quotation marks around your characters' spoken words and start a new paragraph each time the speaker changes. Writing dialogue can be tricky. You want your characters to seem like they are really talking to each other. As you write lines for your characters, think about how they would speak if they were real. If your character is the jolly, wrinkly old man who walks with a cane, make him say the kind of things you think jolly old men might say. Or if your character is the 10-year-old girl with a cheerful smile, she can say things 10-year-old girls you know would say. Tip 4. Think about what will happen in your story. The plot is what happens in a story. All of the events and actions of a story make up the plot. When you write a story, you need to be sure that your reader understands the sequence of events. Sequence means the order in which the events happen. If your reader can't tell what happened first and what happened last, the story might be hard to follow. Tip 5. Create a conflict to develop the characters. Stories are built around a conflict. A conflict is a problem. That's what conflict means, is problem. A character faces. The story tells how the conflict happens. It also shows how the character deals with the problem. The conflict could be dealing with a noisy neighbor or fighting aliens from outer space. All stories must have a conflict. Otherwise, nothing would happen. To develop means to grow or change. Characters who change are more interesting than characters who stay the same. As characters face conflicts, they develop. They may need to become stronger to overcome their troubles. They may learn about themselves or give up something important to them. What are some kinds of story conflicts that interest you? This is a question that is going to be different for each person that answers because we all like different kinds of stories. So I want you to think, what kinds of stories do you like? And, excuse me, my voice is going. What kinds of stories do you like, and what kinds of problems usually happen in those stories? Do you like crazy imaginary stories where they're in outer space and they're fighting bad guys? Or do you like realistic fiction stories where the girl wants to go to the dance but she doesn't have anyone to go with her? Or what kind of stories do you like? What kind of problems do you like in the stories? I personally, as a teacher, like it whenever a character has an inner conflict, such as they're one way at the beginning of the story, and then throughout the story they learn a lesson, so they change. For example, in the story Restart, we read at the beginning of the year by Gordon Corman, Chase was a bully at the beginning of the story, and then throughout the story, because of his accident, he changes into a very kind individual. So some kinds of story conflicts that interest me. Story conflicts that interest me are ones where the character has an internal battle between right and wrong. Now, again, you do not have to put that. You can put anything you want. What are your favorite stories about? Tip number 6, decide who will tell the story. When you write a story, you need to decide who the narrator will be. That's who's telling the story. From whose point of view will the story be told? As you learned in lesson 6, we didn't do lesson 6, but we're going to talk about this. Point of view means who is telling the story. The narrator may be a character in the story or someone outside it. A character in the story can only describe what he or she thinks, feels, hears, and sees. Someone outside it can describe the actions, feelings, and thoughts of all the characters. It's up to you to decide who will tell the story, but once you choose a narrator, you need to tell the whole story from that point of view. So what this is saying is, let's say you have 3 characters in your story. You have John, David, and Rose. You can choose one of those characters to be the main character, and they can tell the story. Let's say Rose is going to be our main character, and she's going to be the narrator. That would mean that the whole story is told from her point of view. So anytime it's talking about Rose, it's not going to say, Rose looked over there. It's going to say, I looked over there. Anything from Rose's point of view is going to say, I, me, we. Now, then it's going to say the names John and David throughout the story because they're not the ones telling the story. So it could say, I looked over and David jumped up on the swing and started to swing back and forth. Then John slid down the slide. I was so happy these two are my best friends. So you'll see that Rose is the narrator in this situation. So she would tell the whole story. Now another option would be you still have your characters, Rose, David, and John, but you want an outside narrator to tell the story. Not one of these 3. Someone else. Someone from the outside. You're never going to talk about this person. You're never going to tell in your story who this person is. It's just a random narrator that's telling the story. Since it's not being told from any of these 3, anytime you talk about them, you're going to call them by their name. You're going to say they, them, she, him, he. Like this. Once upon a time, I'm telling it like it's a fairy tale. Once upon a time, there were 3 best friends, Rose, David, and John. You see how I'm using their names and I'm not telling it from their point of view? I'm telling it from a random narrator. So that's just kind of a tip. You can choose either way. You can do the random narrator, or you can have one of your characters tell the story. Thinking about a fictional narrative. Have you ever planned something and then everything went wrong? It may not have been funny at the time, but maybe you had fun telling your friends about it later. Readers enjoy stories that tell how characters find solutions to problems. The following tips will help you write a fictional narrative. Tip 7. Organize what happens in your story. Like other writing, stories must have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Before you begin writing, think about what will happen and how the story will go. You can use a beginning, middle, and end chart to help you decide. A beginning, middle, and end chart, just so I can show you. We've done these in class, in Miss Helton's and Miss Hutzler's class, and it goes just like this. BME, beginning, middle, end. You can jot down what you want to happen in each part of the story, so you have a clear picture of, okay, this is where my story is starting, and this is where my story is going. Stories mostly follow the order of events. The beginning of the story should introduce the problem and show the first events that happen. It should also introduce the main characters and the setting. Stories use cause and effect to keep the plot moving. When you write a story, show how one event leads to the next, making the problem grow. The middle of the story should show how the characters try to deal with the problems. Don't let the characters win too easily. They should have to try a few different things before they succeed. New problems may arise. The end of the story should show the characters facing their problems once and for all. They might not solve their problems. They may just have to live with them or learn not to make the same mistakes. But most often, the heroes get a happy ending, and that's okay. Tip number 8. Use time words to show order of events. Readers need to understand when things happen in a story. They should know what happened first, next, and last. Mostly you can show this by telling about events in order. But stories are often told out of order too. For instance, a story about a soccer game might start at kickoff, but the narrator might then go and tell about what happened at practice the day before. This is called a flashback. A flashback is a scene that shows what happened before the story began. Here are some time words and phrases that show the order of events. Short amounts of time. Before long, next, soon, a moment later, afterward, just then. Longer amounts of time. After a while, the next day, that night, the following morning. Things happening at the same time. At that moment, while, during, as, when. Linking past and present. Ever since then, before, not long ago, for weeks, back then. There are other ways to play with time in your story. Foreshadowing is a way of hinting what will happen later in the story. The hints can be clear statements like this: it would not be long before Nora learned the truth. Or the hints might be less clear. Javier moped around the house after his best friend Ari moved away. He told his dad that he would never see Ari again. Dad just smiled. In that example, Dad's smile shows the readers that he probably knows something Javier doesn't. We can guess that Javier probably will see Ari again. Now, these two tips that I was talking about, flashback and foreshadowing, you do not have to do that. This is just a tip of something you can do if you want to, but you do not have to. This can be pretty challenging at times. So, if you're not comfortable with that, you can leave that out of your story. Tip number 9. Explain what your characters see and feel. Details are an important part of a story. They add information about people, places, and actions. Compare these two sentences. Sarah heard a noise in her room that scared her. Sarah heard a quiet, scratching noise that gave her goosebumps as she lay frozen in her bed. Notice that adding details makes the second sentence more interesting. It tells the reader more. So between these two sentences right here, the second one is clearly has more details and is more interesting. And this is what we want our writing to sound like instead of this first one. As the story goes on, show what the characters see, hear, and feel. You may even explain what characters taste or smell. It all helps readers imagine what's going on. The more readers can imagine, the more involved in the story they become. Tip 10. Tell about events. It is important to give details about events in a story. There are many things to consider when you write about an event. How quickly does it happen? Where and when does it happen? Who is involved? What are the effects of the event? Anything you imagine about the event will help readers understand it. Use concrete words, words that show exactly what is happening. The more details you give, the more real the event seems. Read this example of an event and notice the details that make it seem real. Without warning, a large duck dove into the swimming pool. There was a loud splash as it hit the water. A storm of drops flew up around it. Screams erupted around the pool. Swimmers began to scatter away from the duck. They scrambled up ladders and heaved themselves onto the concrete. The duck let out a bunch of angry quacks. All around, people buzzed about what was going on. Finally, a little girl pointed her finger and announced, "The mama duck is getting her baby." Sure enough, there was a duckling no one had noticed, getting an earful from its mother. Tip 11. Show that the conflict has ended in a way that makes sense. The end of the story should show the end of the conflict. The characters are no longer struggling with their problems. Either they have solved them or they have accepted them. That is, characters have found a way to live with the things they can't change. As a writer, you need to show how the conflict has ended. The way the conflict ends should feel right. It shouldn't come out of nowhere. For instance, if your hero is trying to climb a mountain, he or she should make it to the top. Sorry guys, I got cut off there. So if your hero is trying to climb a mountain, he or she should make it to the top or give up. Your hero should not get a ride on a helicopter that has not been mentioned before. The ending should also be something the characters would do. Imagine you have shown a character is stubborn and sure of himself or herself. The character would not simply give up and say, "Oh well, maybe next time." That doesn't mean your ending can't be surprising, but it should fit with the events that came before. A cowboy adventure should not end with a flying saucer, unless there is a reason for it in the story. For example, imagine the cowboys have been trying to figure out why their horses disappear each night. If the horses turn out to be aliens, that would be surprising, but it would still make sense in the story. And here is our prompt for what you guys will be writing. It says, write a story about a student who must explain how he or she lost a library book. So your story is going to be about a student who must explain how he or she lost a library book. The story can be something that could really happen, or it can be fantasy, a story that could not really happen. So if you wanted this to be a realistic story about a student that's going to school and they lost their library book, you can make it realistic. That's called realistic fiction. Or you can make it be imaginative to where there might be characters. It might have something to do with a monster or outer space or a unicorn or, made up things. Outer space is not made up, but you could use made up things in your story. And you could make it to where it's something that could not really happen. Maybe a talking dog stole your book or whatever you want to do. It's up to you if you want it to be realistic or imaginative. Review the writer's checklist on this page. Then use page 205 to plan your story. Finally, write your story on pages 206 and 207. Here is a wonderful writer's checklist for you. This will help you to make sure that you are on track and you have each piece that you are needed to write a good narrative story. So here's your writer's checklist. A well-written narrative establishes a situation, has a narrator and characters, clearly describes a setting, is organized to show sequence of events with a plot that unfolds clearly, uses dialogue and description to develop experiences and events and to show characters' responses, uses sequence words to clearly show the order of events, uses words and phrases and sensory details to describe events and experiences, concludes with the solution to the problem, uses correct grammar, spelling, punctuation, capitalization, and sentence structure, and has a clear beginning, middle, and end. If you need help with any of these items or you can't remember what that means, go back to the beginning of your packet and look at the tips because they're in there and we just went through them. Here is the planning page that you will use. This is like a brainstorming page. You can make a list, you can make a web, you can make an outline. However you want to plan, make sure you put your characters, who your characters are going to be, where and when the story is going to take place, so your setting, the problem, how the problem is solved. Include those things in your plan so that you know where your story is going. You never want to start writing your story and not know where it's going to go in the end, because that's when your story just starts to sound crazy. If you have a clear plan of the beginning, middle, and end of your story and who the characters are, the setting, and all that, your story will sound like it's planned and you'll know where you're going to go with your story. And then these next pages are for you to write your story. Now there's only 2 pages here, but if you would like to, you may get, lined paper, use your own paper. It doesn't just have to be 2 pages long. It can be however long you want it to be, okay? Please let me know if you have any questions and have a great rest of your day. Bye.